Okay, I think we'll make a start. So hopefully the microphone is all clear for everybody. Welcome everyone. My name's Associate Professor Paul McGinn. I'm the director of the UWA Public Policy Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to the 2025 Laki Jayasuriya Oration, which is to be delivered by Senator Varun Ghosh. But before we kind of get into formal proceedings, I'd just like to acknowledge that the University of Western Australia sits on the Whadjuk Noongar land, and that the Whadjuk Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of this land and continues to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledges here. And I'd also just acknowledge a number of people here this evening. So first of all, Ken Wyatt and Ross Taylor, who are on the advisory board from the UWA Public Policy Institute. Professor Shamit Sagar, who established the Laki Jayasuriya Oration. And, you're up there, Shamit, welcome. Professor Kanishka Jayasuriya, Laki's son, who is here this evening as well. So welcome back again, Kanishka. And Professor Stephen Lund from Social Work and Social Policy. I didn't think I saw Stephen, there you are, right there, welcome. And I just have a couple of apologies, particularly for Varun. Varun, Minister Tony Booty and Professor Matthew Taunce express their apologies. They wish they could be here this evening. I know that Matthew's a cricket tragic along with yourself, and he's really sad that he couldn't be here, but both the Minister and Matthew wish you all the best for this evening's oration. We're going to do things a little bit different this year. I'm going to have a very minimal role this year, but I'm very delighted that another of our advisory board members, Maria Osman, is going to be kind of in the hot seat and kind of running things. So thank you, Maria. And if you don't know Maria, I just have a very short blurb to read out about Maria. So Maria has over 30 years experience as a senior policy advisor on the intersections of gender equality, multiculturalism, and human rights. She has worked in the government, community, and university sectors as an advocate, policy advisor, and strategist, speaker, and mentor. And I've been told to stop there on things. So that's Maria's instructions, not mine. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Maria, who's going to give a short kind of address and overview of things. And then she will invite Senator Ghosh to deliver the oration. So thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so nice to see people, old friends, colleagues, people who've worked in this sector for a very long time. So we feel very comfortable, Varun and I, looking out on this fantastic audience. This is the fifth oration, as was said, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the elders past, present and rising. I'd also want to send my best wishes to Laki Jayasuriya, who can't be with us this evening. She's been with us for the other orations and was Laki's partner in life and in work, so she's sorely missed tonight. The oration was established as an annual event by UWA. And in the beginning, it was a partnership with a number of other organisations. Its aim is to spotlight contemporary issues of racism, migration, refugee policy, cultural and religious diversity, social and political reform, issues that were central to Laki's lifelong work. Professor Jayasuriya was far more than a distinguished academic. He was a social justice advocate, political advisor and mentor, and a friend to many of us in this room. I worked on this campus for 13 years and I survived because Laki was a friend of mine on this campus. He was always there to listen, to guide, and I'm sure he did that for many, many people here tonight. His work on migration policy and multiculturalism laid the foundation for how we understand racism, inclusion, identity, and justice in our country today. Nigel Newen, a lawyer and political commentator, noted in 2021 that we live in the multicultural Australia that Professor Jayasuriya helped create. Laki provided strategic counsel to prime ministers, premiers, ministers, policymakers at all levels of government. When I was a policy advisor, he was always on the phone to me. It was fantastic. to deepen their and our understanding of the challenges and opportunities facing a multicultural Australia, particularly within the context of colonisation and dispossession. In last year's oration, Associate Professor Anna Boucher reflected, Laki was himself from a migrant background, and so often our personal migration experiences shape us as scholars and policymakers, even if their influence is subtle or unseen. Events such as this evening's gathering provide an opportunity to reflect on how our own histories shape our identities and life's purpose. The inaugural Jayasuriya Oration was delivered in 2020 by the Honourable Dr. Geoff Gallop, former Premier of WA, with the title, Democracy, Human Rights and Multiculturalism. Can there be consensus? The Gallop paper recognised the rigorous thinking Laki brought to these issues and how these underpin the WA Charter of Multiculturalism, a landmark document that redefined multiculturalism through 4 core principles: civic values, fairness, equality and participation. Dr. Gallop put it this way, what binds us is not traditional culture, but the principles upon which this society is governed, including mutual respect, freedom from prejudice and discrimination, and equality of opportunity. The Multicultural Charter, of which Laki and others in this room, I might add, was the principal architect, challenged us to ask, are there barriers to full participation in and enjoyment of all aspects of society, social, political, cultural and economic? This charter builds upon the liberal and egalitarian values, but goes further, recognising the unique status of Aboriginal people as first Australians and redefining equality from a passive concept to an active commitment of substantive equality. In 2022, the Honourable Dr. Anne Alley's oration titled, Why We Need to Recalibrate Our Approach to Multiculturalism, reminded us that multiculturalism, as Laki envisioned it, was never just about cultural celebration. It was about equal political, social and economic participation. In a full circle moment this year, Anne was appointed Minister for Multicultural Affairs and the portfolio elevated to Cabinet, in brackets, finally, I might add. As well as being thrilled for Anne, I thought of Laki when the announcement was made. He would have been very, very pleased because, again, he was a mentor to Anne, as she said at her oration. So that's a beautiful full circle moment. One of Anne's first actions as a minister was to re-establish the Office of Multicultural Affairs. Laki would have been cheering all the way. And so to the present, the 2025 Laki Jayasuriya Oration is being delivered in the year the NAIDOC theme chosen by elders and leaders is The Next Generation, Strength, Vision and Legacy. The message from Indigenous elders, Strength, Vision and Legacy, is a gift and direction, not only for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but to all Australians. It is especially important for multicultural communities whose stories are an essential part of the fabric and story of modern Australia. In that spirit, it is my great pleasure to welcome the next generation of leaders, Senator Varun Ghosh, to deliver the oration. Varun is a new Labor Senator for WA, a contributing writer to the Australian Book Review, a cricket tragic, and as I listened to his first speech in last week, which was excellent, he's also a hockey tragic. Prior to entering politics, Varun was a barrister at Francis Burt Chambers in Perth, with a wide-ranging practice in commercial, financial, industrial disputes. As I find my papers, they should have been in order. As well as equity, administrative law and constitutional law. Also very involved in politics here at UWA with Young Labour and the UN Youth Association, to name a few. And I'd also like to welcome Varun's parents here tonight. It's lovely that you could join us. Varun also worked as a senior associate in litigation at King & Woods Mallison in Perth, a legal consultant at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., advising in relation to financial and insolvency policy, and an associate in the banking team at White & Case LLP in New York. He also taught administrative and constitutional law at this university. He has a Bachelor of Arts, First Class Honours, a Bachelor of Law, First Class Honours from the University of Western Australia, and a Masters of Law degree from the University of Cambridge, where he studied on the Frank Dowding Law Scholarship. I'd like you to give Varun a very warm welcome to tonight's oration. Thank you.
Good evening. I can also speak up. Is that better? Okay. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Meeting this evening to talk about migration and multiculturalism in Australia, it is well to reflect that the settlers and migrants to this country have built upon and benefited from the rich and continuing history and culture of First Nations peoples in Australia. I would also like to acknowledge Professor Kanishka Jayasuriya, Dr. Pradeep Jayasuriya and members of the Jayasuriya family who are here this evening, as well as the Honourable Ken Wyatt, Ross Taylor and other members of the UWA Public Policy Institute. I am truly grateful to Paul McGinn, the director of this institute, for the opportunity to give this oration and have very much appreciated the assistance of Claire Feenan and Ben Perks from the institute. I'd also like to say thank you to Professor Shamit Sagar for establishing the Laki Jayasuriya Oration. The oration offers an important opportunity to discuss and explore multiculturalism, migration and national identity in Australia. Those opportunities are too few, but are of growing importance for the reasons that I will outline in this talk. As Australians, we live in a country enriched by the contributions of those who have come to our shores from all over the world. There are few better examples of this than the life and career of Professor Laki Jayasuriya. Thank you to Maria for those wonderful and personal reflections on Professor Jayasuriya and his contributions to the development of ideas of inclusion, identity and justice in Australia. I didn't have the pleasure of knowing Professor Jayasuriya, though one of the real pleasures of preparing for this address was the opportunity to learn a little bit more about his work and his career. Three attributes emerged from that exploration, and they're apposite to the subject we're discussing this evening. The first is courage. It takes a particular kind of courage, a depth of courage, to leave your home and to strive to make a life in a new country, a country that is far away and markedly different from the place you are leaving behind. Professor Jayasuriya had the courage to come to Australia and make a life here, make a home here. He also had the courage to work at the frontiers of migration and multicultural policy in Australia. He did so at a time when many of the ideas and concepts that we accept now were still nascent and highly contested in our community. That takes a particular form of courage. The second attribute is political acumen. Dr. Jeff Gallup observed in his 2020 oration that Professor Jayasuriya brought a combination of intellectual purity and strategic and political acumen to his academic and policy work. In Dr. Gallup's words, responding to the voices of the second and third generations of ethnic origin in the 1990s, Laki was at the forefront of those seeking to bring relevance to the cause of multiculturalism, which had become too focused on culturalist traditions and celebrations, not negatives in themselves, but in need of an injection of politics. The third attribute that emerged was that of rigour. Professor Jayasuriya's academic work and written treatises were evidence-based. They were rigorous and they were unsentimental in their approach to issues of migration and multiculturalism in Australia. That is something that is valuable in this particularly contentious and often contested field. His written work also shows the power of weaving together history, data, and logical analysis in advocating for a vision of the society that we want to create, and in his case, that he wanted to create. Courage, political acumen, and rigour are essential attributes to the development and implementation of good policy, and Professor Jayasuriya's example in that respect is inspiring. My topic this evening is migration and the national interest. To be personal for a moment, the subject of migration and its relationship to the Australian national interest are extremely important to me. I am the child of migrants to Australia, and I'm deeply grateful and happy that my parents are here this evening. My family has benefited enormously from being welcomed into Australian society with the spirit of generosity that defines Australia and Australians. This generosity can be a source of deep optimism for our future in this country. And I know that migrants make tremendous contributions to Australia. In my own family, my father, my mother, and my brother all work as doctors in the public health system. As a commercial lawyer who's taken to politics, the case is less clear for me, I appreciate. As an indirect beneficiary of Australia's migration system, and as a person who spent my life to date navigating the channels of Australian multiculturalism, I'm also aware of the anxiety and concern that conversations about the place of migrants in our society can provoke. I firmly believe, however, that the health of our society and our public discourse requires sustained, honest, good faith, and at times difficult conversations about sensitive subjects like migration, and that a failure to have these conversations may precipitate unintended or undesirable consequences. So with that preamble, I intend to explore three propositions in the substance of my oration this evening. The first is that migration and the cultural diversity that has come with it have unquestionably advanced the interests of Australia as a nation. The second is that despite the benefits that migration and multiculturalism have brought to date, community support for migration and a multicultural, open and pluralist society cannot be taken for granted, and Australia must pay close attention to some of the trends and patterns that we are seeing around the world, and to a lesser extent here at home. The third proposition I'm going to explore is that improving the design, integrity and rigour of Australia's migration program and policies offers one path to try to ensure that support for migration and multiculturalism in Australia, and to ensure that migration can continue to serve the national interest while retaining community support. The first proposition is the easiest. Australia has benefited from migration. It may seem trite to observe that Australia is the beneficiary of waves of migration across its history, but in the current global environment, that proposition is worth repeating and making good. It's not an extensive treatise this evening, but I will look at it from an economic and social perspective. The economic contribution of migrants to Australia has been significant and sustained across our history. Migration, and particularly skilled migration, has been a significant contributor to Australia's economic growth by filling skill gaps, supporting increased labour force participation, and dealing with some of the demographic problems that arise with an ageing population, and generating spillover benefits through enhanced productivity and innovation. Our skilled migration program has made substantial contributions to the rate of labour productivity growth in this country. That economic contribution is even more pronounced when you consider the taxation contributions of migrants and the contribution migrants have made to Australia's fiscal health. Using the fiscal impact of New Australians model, which models the impact of permanent migrants over their remaining lifetimes in Australia, the Commonwealth Treasury observed that the estimated financial impact of the overall permanent migrant cohort is $127,000 more per person than the Australian population overall. It's important that we have these facts, and it's important that we know them when we're taking part in the debate that I'm going to lead into. The benefits that migration has brought to our society are harder to measure, but they are no less profound. Few countries in the world, if any, have been more receptive to migrants than Australia. Since 1945, Australia has welcomed some 8.6 million new permanent migrants, and the overseas-born population has grown from around 10% in 1947 to around 31.5% in 2024. It's worthwhile pausing on that number to think about what it reflects. It reflects an enormous change in the fabric of Australian society across, in historical terms, a relatively short period of time. While having some of the highest migration rates in the world, Australia's migration program has enjoyed significant community support, almost uniquely among developed nations in terms of its longevity and its consistency. And social cohesion in Australia is measured higher than many OECD countries. We're near the top, in effect. Hearteningly, there's also evidence that immigrants in Australia are not only valued, but relatively well integrated into Australian society. The Scanlon Institute produces an annual social cohesion report based on surveys and responses. And the 2024 report indicated that 82% of respondents agreed that immigrants improve Australian society by bringing new ideas and cultures. 79% of respondents say they have two or more close friends from different national, ethnic or religious backgrounds, and 86% say they like meeting and getting to know people from different ethnic and cultural groups. Those are very heartening numbers, and they put paid to the notion that migration is a problem socially or that there is a failure of migrants to integrate in Australia. In modern Australia, cultural, linguistic and ethnic diversity are also increasingly recognised as sources of strength and pride for our country. That's the good news. That's where Proposition 1 ends. Proposition 2 is less good. The trends around the world are less encouraging, and community support for migration and multiculturalism in Australia cannot be taken for granted. We must learn the lessons of what we are seeing overseas. Around the developed world, anti-immigration sentiments have gained traction, and parties centred on anti-migration policies and rhetoric have moved from the fringe to the mainstream. Anti-immigration ideas and rhetoric have moved into the centre of the political discourse in many countries around the world, in Europe and America. The significance, or the numerical significance of this change is disturbing. In the UK council elections in May 2025, Nigel Farage's Reform Party won 677 seats out of the 1,600 being contested. Centre to Reform's agenda is a xenophobia and an anti-migrant sentiment. In the 2025 German elections, the Alternative for Germany won 20.8% of the total vote, the second largest total behind the Christian Democratic Union at 28.6%, and now holds 152 of 630 seats in the Bundestag. In the French national elections in 2024, Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party won 142 seats, roughly a quarter of the seats in the French National Assembly. And no one in this room needs reminding that in November 2024, Donald Trump was elected once again as President of the United States of America. These are all sources or causes for some alarm and certainly for some reflection. I think it's also worth noting that in each of the instances or in each of the parties that I've discussed, anti-immigrant sentiment is not limited to the narrow enforcement of migration rules, but tends to expand to a whole range of other undesirable and pernicious types of rhetoric about the society and its members. I think it's fair to say that each of those groups has attempted to, and to a degree has succeeded in undermining social cohesion and social harmony in the countries in which they operate. In Australia's history, debates about migration and multiculturalism have been complicated, emotive, contested, and deeply political. It's a veritable briar patch. The passion that these debates arouse among people make them potent political weapons. And we have seen political parties and actors in Australia, I won't name them this evening, attempt to exploit concerns about migration for political gain, as recently as the last federal election. At the same time, we've seen shifts in attitudes towards migration in Australia and immigration in Australia. The same Scanlon Institute report that I cited some figures from earlier found that the percentage of people in Australia who say that the number of immigrants to Australia is too high rose from 41% in 2019 to 49% in 2024. When you break down those numbers demographically, the results are interesting, but show a consistency of that trend. Of those over 65, the number who considered immigration was too high rose from 58% in 2019 to 62% in 2024, a relatively modest increase. Among 18 to 24-year-olds in Australia who responded to this survey, the number who considered immigration was too high rose from 16% in 2019 to 35% in 2024. That's more than doubled in the youngest demographic surveyed. 25 to 34-year-olds, the number who considered immigration was too high rose from 15% in 2019 to 33% in 2024, another significant increase. The portion of overseas-born Australians from non-English speaking backgrounds who believe immigration is too high in Australia rose from 16% in 2022 to 39% in 2024. The proportion of those born in Australia who believe immigration is too high increased from 26% in 2022 to 51% in 2024. There is a change of sentiment occurring in the Australian community around immigration. Those numbers indicate a significant shift. What's interesting, though, is that of the respondents who said immigration was too high, 75% agreed that multiculturalism has been good for Australia, 69% agreed that immigrants are generally good for Australia's economy, and 68% agree that immigrants improve Australian society by bringing new culture and ideas. So the news is not all bad, but I think we would be unwise to ignore that broad trend and the direction it may suggest. Concern with immigrations in Australia does not appear to have translated, at least in terms of the results of that survey, to widespread hostility to migration or multiculturalism, but it's a mistake to assume that that will not or cannot occur in Australia in the future. And that is particularly the case in a political environment in which not only is there greater polarisation, but commitments to policy ideas and commitments to political ideologies is far more volatile than it has been in the past. The experience in Europe and in other parts of the world is that frustration with immigration levels or a lack of integrity in the immigration system can quickly erupt, and the political momentum that those eruptions generate can be very difficult to slow or stop. And so that really brings me to my third proposition this evening, which at its heart is addressing the question, how do we stop that? How do we reverse some of those trends? How do we make sure that Australia's migration program retains support and retains legitimacy in the eyes of the community? And I say that because I believe that migration and a properly well-calibrated migration program has not only been in Australia's national interest, but it will remain in Australia's national interest for the foreseeable future. The benefits that I discussed earlier are benefits that continue to accrue. And Australia, for a range of reasons, demographic and otherwise, needs to utilise migration, and migration has a lot to offer. But the other matter of concern is that it's very clear that our migration system is broken in a number of respects. From 2016 onwards, there have been a series of reports delivered by organisations as diverse as CEDA, as the Productivity Commission, and then most recently government reviews commissioned by the Albanese government when it came to office, that indicate that there are serious problems in the way that our migration system operates in Australia. In the review commissioned by the government and conducted by Dr. Martin Parkinson, one of its key conclusions was that there are key aspects of this system that are broken. And the report they published in March 2023 stated quite clearly the objectives of the migration program are unclear, and successive governments and policymakers have responded to challenges through piecemeal reforms which have not addressed fundamental and underlying issues. Ensuring our migration program is fit for purpose, that it serves the national interest, and that it retains community support is vital to Australia's longer-term interests. I don't propose to go into a comprehensive suggestion or package of reforms here this evening, you'll be relieved to know, but I would like to discuss a few issues that I think illustrate some of the problems that have been identified and also some of the ways that we might seek to address them in the longer term. The first 2 points relate to the design of the migration system. The first is that Australia's migration system operates best when it has as its focus, not exclusively, but it has as its focus attracting skilled migrants to Australia. The design of the system has been most successful in economic and to some degree in social terms as well, when it is focused on providing the skills Australia needs and attracting migrants who have been economically successful in Australia. One of the problems that we've had in the last, and it goes back probably longer than 10 years, has been a gentle shift away from a focus on skills and to some extent on permanent migration, and towards an increase in the number of temporary migrants and this concept of permanent temporariness that has crept into the Australian system. The number of temporary migrants in Australia doubled from around 900,000 people in 2007 to around 1.8 million in 2023. A lack of proper planning and a lack of focus on where these migrants were going to end up has meant that these increases did not address labour shortages in key industries. They did not address labour shortages in regional areas. And a previous speaker at this oration, Professor Anna Boucher, went so far as to say that this temporary system and the way it had been set up created, in effect, a de facto low-skilled temporary immigration program. That's the first point. In terms of design, we need to focus on skills, and they need to be skills that the Australian economy needs. The second point on design I'd like to discuss relates to community concern or community feedback. The design of the Australian migration system must be responsive to concerns within the community. For long periods of time, the debate about migration in Australia has elevated the binary or the extremes, those who romanticise migration on one hand and those who demonise it on the other. And in designing our migration program, we need to focus on where most Australian people are, which is somewhere in between that. Their concerns are around their own futures, their families' futures, their communities' futures, and the long-term interests of Australia. And that is where we need to focus in relation to our migration program. For a long time in Australia, there have been growing concerns in the Australian community, among the young and the old, among migrants and those who were born here, and others, that the system did not appear to be working in the interests of them or their communities. If those concerns are not addressed, support for migration in Australia diminishes. One way in the design of these programs that we can address those concerns is to listen carefully and to address certain friction points that, though in the scheme of a program might not be that consequential, nevertheless end up for the community undermining their confidence in the migration program and develop points of resentment against it. By way of one example, the significant increase in net overseas migration post-COVID-19 has contributed to a perception of increased pressure on civil and community infrastructure and on housing. It is neither fair nor accurate to lay the blame for housing shortages, traffic congestion, or school crowding in this country at the feet of migrants. But nor is it wise to fail to acknowledge and respond to a legitimate community concern that in at least some of its manifestations is directed towards the migration program. This means our migration program also needs to be flexible and respond to those concerns quickly and as they occur. We have to acknowledge that this means a reduction in migrant numbers if that's what the community is asking for and that's what our economic interests are indicating. The third point that I'd make is that our migration system must have integrity. In some ways that sounds remarkably straightforward, but what has emerged from a series of these reports, including the rapid review by former Commissioner Christine Nixon and the Parkinson Review, both of which were handed down in March 2023, is that our migration system has lacked integrity for some time in key aspects. The integrity of our migration system, including confidence in that migration system's ability to manage flows and reduce fraud and rorting within the system, is vital to ensuring that the system both has legitimacy and retains community support. A lack of integrity in the migration system undermines Australian sovereignty and will almost certainly in the long term undermine confidence in the system. The final point I'll make in relation to this third proposition that I'm advancing is one that is really reflected in the work of Professor Jayasuriya, and that is the need for rigour and evidence-based policy making in the migration space. To review Professor Jayasuriya's treatise, which he wrote with Ki Pukong on the Asianisation of Australia, some facts about the myths, is to see migration advocacy at its finest. It's also to see an unsentimental approach to how migration policy should be developed, and that is it should be fact-based. The logic and analysis must be rigorous, and it shouldn't start from a predetermined ideological position. The proposition I'd make, or the proposal I'd make, and I think this is the simplest aspect, in fact, to fix, is that our migration system requires better data. As matters stand, the evidence base for the formation and evaluation of migration policy in Australia is deeply inadequate. A lack of longitudinal data and surveys about the performance of migrants in the Australian community is but one example of what's missing. These data deficits constrain the measurement of immigrant performance and outcomes, but also community-wide impacts over time. The lack of data inhibits our ability to develop targeted and effective policies, or to know what policies are working and what policies are not. Further, the public availability of data about migration in Australia has a vital role to play in assisting and facilitating informed debate about migration in our community. This transparency, the availability of reliable data, is so important in the nature of debates about migration particularly. Migration debates are emotive. Many of the opponents of migration, many of the parties that I referred to earlier that have found traction in Europe, are not engaging in fact-based argument. They're not engaging with reason necessarily, but they're engaging with emotion. They've shown a propensity to use and to effectively deploy misinformation and disinformation in the public debate about migration. And the speed with which that is shared in a social media and digital environment is really unprecedented. The availability of reliable, timely, and transparently collected or generated information is vital in fighting that sort of rhetoric. It's vital in the long term in winning the sort of debate that I'm talking about in terms of against some of the trends and some of the more concerning aspects of those movements. So I conclude really where I started, which is that Australia is a nation that has been built on and benefited from migration. Migration has helped lift our society economically, and we have one of the most remarkably diverse, cohesive and harmonious communities around the world. That is a triumph of the Australian model of multiculturalism. It is a triumph of the people who have formed an important part of developing its intellectual foundations and its policy framework. And that includes Professor Jayasuriya, whose oration I'm giving this evening. But at the same time, we cannot ignore those worrying trends, both overseas and to a lesser extent at home. We operate in an environment where there are political actors in the Australian political system, and they are on the conservative side of politics, who are willing and have shown a recent willingness to try and exploit aspects of these sentiments for their political gain. To combat that, we need to improve the integrity of the system. We need to be vigilant about design improvements that make the migration program in Australia more responsive to the national interest, but also more responsive to community concerns. And above all, we need better information, because that's what informs each of those steps. The opportunity here is enormous. Australia has had, across its history, a remarkably successful migration and multicultural program. What the community seem to indicate at the moment is an ongoing support for that and a deep belief in some of the factors that underpin it. We've got to build on that. We cannot take it for granted, because in the long run, migration is in our national interest. And we need to make sure that that debate is had in an open way, had in an honest way, and it's a debate that I think is very important that we win. Thank you.
Just before we go into the Q&A, I thought I'd just warm Varun up a little bit with a couple of questions. So you can have a think about the questions you might well ask. Undoubtedly, a very strong message about reforming the migration program and being more responsive to the needs of society and understanding the community attitudes. The challenge, I think, is that we are all migrants. So that's one. When do we stop being a migrant? Two. And the community attitudes, I'm curious about that because we can quote data and surveys, but that's a very small population group that they survey, but we can look at the trends. So what do you really think is happening with community attitudes to push that a little bit? And community attitudes are governed by our leaders. And unfortunately, in the last 5 or 6 years, we've had, prior to the Labor government, we had some extreme cases of negativity towards certain parts of the community, particularly those like myself who are of African origin and those of us who have brown skin. So is that the community attitudes that you're talking about? So we agree we need to reform the migration program. We need leaders to do that, but we also need to understand, truly understand, what is happening with community attitudes. Couple of questions there.
Sorry, I'm just writing them down so that I don't miss one, but if I do, please pull me back. Let me be very clear at the outset that in terms of the community attitudes that I'm referring to, or rather the ones that I'm not referring to, I'm not referring to those members of the community, and they do exist, who are reflexively opposed to migration because they hold prejudiced beliefs. So that's not what I'm talking about here. And I still think in Australia that group remains a distinct minority of the Australian population and the Australian community. I think most Australians are incredibly fair-minded and also are not prejudiced in that way. But I think the risk of policy failures, particularly in migration, is that those malevolent agents who do argue for that sort of prejudice, from that sort of prejudiced position, and the supporters who hold those prejudiced views gain traction in broader sections of the community that don't hold those views but can nevertheless have issues with aspects of what they perceive as the migration program, or have issues with what they perceive as a lack of integrity in that program. I think leadership is actually the most important thing in this space. And there's a wonderful book written by Donald Horne called Looking for Leadership. And in it he has a really quite moving but quite a sad passage, I think. And it's moving because there's a quote in it that says, in a democracy with good leadership, people are capable of creating better than they know. And that's a beautifully aspirational quote. But it then goes on to talk about migration policy in Australia and about the end of a two-party consensus that lasted, give or take, from 1966 to, give or take, the early 1990s. You could go back to 1988. And that two-party consensus was, on a range of issues, but migration is at the centre of it, not to play racial politics with migration. And that's gone. It's not to say that there aren't very good faith actors on the conservative side of politics in Australia who refuse to do it and engage in good faith and are true leaders in our society, but there are also a number who are not. And I think Peter Dutton was one of them. And so I think when you have a serious leader or a leader of a party of alternative government a party of one of the mainstream parties in Australia who engages in that behaviour, I think it really undermines the cause. And it does really undermine the sort of thing I'm talking about here, which is building a consensus around the benefits of migration, the value of multiculturalism, and its kind of long-term foundations in Australian society.
Thank you. A very well-measured and deep response. Thank you, Varun. I've just got one more question before we move to the audience. You know, the challenge around migration, and you talked a little bit about, well, you talked about skilled migration. So if you have the skills and the qualifications, that's one thing. So how do the leaders then balance that need for the skills that we need in the society with our commitment to the human rights obligations for asylum seekers and refugees? And again, that I see that cohort as part of our migration program. So how do you think the leaders are going in relation to that, and how do you think we can maintain that so that when we talk about migration, we are including asylum seekers and people who came here with a refugee experience or are coming here?
So in one sense, in my mind, or in the way I think of our migration program, the humanitarian stream is quite separate from the skilled permanent and skilled temporary and other streams of migration into Australia, because I think the reasons that underpin those different streams are quite distinct. The national interest needs or policy purposes that we're seeking to serve are not the same. So I think that's important. So I wasn't for a moment really reflecting on the humanitarian stream in my talk this evening. It was really referring to the permanent and temporary skilled streams. How are our leaders going on it? Politics in this country in the last, let's say, 25 years, 24 years really is what we're talking about, has had the issue of asylum seekers front and centre. And what has emerged from that is that there is a visceral political reaction by the Australian people to any sense that we have lost control of our borders, or that there is likely to be a large number of boats arriving on our shores. And I think that is the single biggest political imperative in that space. But that's not the whole picture when it comes to the humanitarian stream. And so I think Australia is a developed and wealthy country, and we should be as generous as we can be on the humanitarian side. And we have been generous historically. But I think that often gets overshadowed by the way the political debate occurs in that space, which is largely based on how someone arrives rather than a particular view on the size and scope of the humanitarian stream.
I could ask a lot more questions, but I'm going to now open it to you, the audience. And I'd be, if it can be a question rather than a statement, and keep it simple. And Paul and Claire have got the microphones, and you can direct your question to Varun on.
Yeah, you're going to select the questioners.
Go here first. You.
Thank you, Senator Ghosh, for your oration. Thanks a lot. My name is Dev. My question is, has the skilled migration program and the temporary program both been used as a fiscal program? As you talk about, it lacks objective, the program, because it's a lazy fiscal policy or a fiscal lever to be pulled, and the short-termism of the governments, which are only, it's a federal decision, it's a 3-year term, so you need a short-term fiscal hit. You push the program both ways, whether it's temporary or skilled. So how can we go beyond the cycles of these 3 years in terms of looking at more objective beyond, as you said, migrants bring more culture and ideas. It's not about money. So how do you limit the language not to be used as a fiscal lever, but more of ideas, more of intelligence lever?
I would just start by saying that I think the economic benefit to Australia is one of the underlying reasons that we bring permanent and temporary migrants into Australia. So I don't want to discount the importance of that. In terms of are migrants being used as a fiscal lever? I don't think they are. I don't think they are by governments of either stripes, actually. I think the permanent migration stream has been remarkably consistent, save for a period around the COVID disruptions, both during the COVID period and then shortly afterwards. It will return to that more consistent number under the government's proposed policy. And I think in terms of temporary migrants, the variety of different streams and sources of people who would fall under the temporary migration program and the ways in which they're linked to a range of different either indicia or Australia's treaty obligations overseas or our agreement with New Zealand or particular work-related schemes like the PALM scheme strongly suggests, and in fact I think is almost definitive, that it's not being pulled in some fiscal lever way. It's just the way some of these programs have developed.
My name is Professor Jayasuriya. I have been teaching here for a long time. But one of the things that there's a sort of not a gray area, but it's a sort of a backdoor thing. When I go to recruitment fairs anywhere in Asia, what do you think the first question people ask me? What degree allows me to get PR? Okay? It's not about what subject, what the passion to learn. It's an avenue to get PR, right? And that's state. But now, before the general election, both the Labour and the Coalition said, we're going to limit international students. But 2 weeks ago, it's changed. The Coalition says we need to have a better look at this, while Labour has completely changed, have increased the number. Do you know why this change has come about?
As a junior backbench Labor senator, I can honestly say I don't. I didn't really touch upon educational migration in my talk, and you could really give a talk about educational migration streams in Australia, how they have developed, whether they are applied or constructed in a rigorous way, and whether or not they form a coherent part of how higher education is funded in this country. But the very short answer is no, I'm not sure why.
Thanks, Senator. I'm actually going to make two brief comments. One, I'm sure that Laki would be very pleased about, and that's about people like you and others in the federal and the state parliaments that now better reflect the cultural or plural diversity of this nation. We keep talking of ourselves as representative democracies. We've been anything but that until the last couple of elections. The other one I believe that Laki would be very, very concerned about is this, and that is the formal delinking of multiculturalism and citizenship. Laki, more than any other academic before him or after him, has linked those two in a way that nobody else has. And that is where the power of multiculturalism is finally going to come from. By delinking that politically, structurally, right across Australia, we are doing ourselves a big disfavor. Thank you.
I'll comment briefly on both. You're spot on. I did like the first one a lot. To return after the 2025 election to the Labor Party's caucus in Canberra was to face a sight in political terms that is unprecedented in Australia. The number of people from culturally and ethnically diverse backgrounds in Australia in the federal caucus is the highest it's ever been, but it's by sort of orders of magnitude over where it was before. It's really quite remarkable. I think it's more than 10% now of the Australian Federal Labor Party caucus. It would. It's probably cheeky of me to say this, but it is the Labor Party that's doing it. No one else has got that much more diverse. So, in terms of how that's improved, I'm not sure that's good. I'm not sure that's good for the country, but in terms of where diversity is coming from, be it gender diversity or ethnic and cultural diversity at the moment in Australian politics, it's the Australian Labor Party and daylight second. The second point is, I think on the citizenship point, it's really a beautiful part of the way and Professor Jayasuriya's argumentation works in some of his work is the links he draws and the benefits he draws from that. But that's also something that's come out in the Productivity Commission's report in 2016, and there are overtones of it in Parkinson's review as well, which is that pathways to citizenship do offer a very good way of maximising the benefit both to migrants to this country and to our community. So I think it's very important.
We don't have a Minister for Citizenship anymore. That is the link to multicultural.
Shannon? No, I'll come to you. I can see.
Thank you. Is that on? Can you hear me? Yeah, Varun, thank you very much for that, and particularly the dissection of what you meant by the description of the, I guess, crumbling community support we've seen for a long time. When I listen to what you're saying, I find half of myself, in many ways, agreeing with you in favour of a more rigorous approach, more evidence, more data, to sum it up in essentially a much more technocratic approach to these matters. And it probably is a good thing, and it's been fraying at the edges. But I also hear myself listening to this and actually pushing back and disagreeing. Let me explain why. Because it has the inadvertent effect of emphasizing what I would call a utilitarian approach to migration. And you see this acutely in Australia, by the way, when we emphasize time after time, cite endless examples of commissions and inquiries that end up with some sort of decimal point calculation to say the upsides outweigh the downsides. And you very quickly can end up in a situation whereby we're in favor of migration because, frankly, it helps us to remain rich. Or at least may not be our intention, but that may be the signal that people receive in Australia, that they can see it's related to our growth and our prosperity. And many things can go wrong with that, one of which could be that we therefore are in favor of the good migrant and ambivalent about the not so good migrant. And you very quickly get into a sense of a hierarchy. Second of all, of course, there's very scant evidence to show that the first generation that come to countries such as Australia automatically and inevitably end up as being net contributors at the second generation. So the kind of deal can be off. And then lastly, of course, we talk about the demography of migrants and their young age profile. And well, guess what? You know, people get older and age profiles begin to converge. I have some real misgivings about the idea that migration fundamentally is a utilitarian matter. I think it is part of it, without a doubt, and we don't want to be in a situation where Australia could be accused of importing vast amounts of, as it were, poverty at the point of entry. I don't think that's desirable. But we need to find ways to emphasize, not just include, but emphasize a non-utilitarian way of describing these so-called benefits. Because I think, I'm going on a bit, but the only other example I think of in recent times where a country has really been asked to comment on, and in fact vote with its feet on migration, was the de facto referendum on migration, which is the Brexit vote in the UK. Well, what do we learn from that? All the evidence, all the knowledge, all the data went out the window. It became a very, very emotive exercise around who we approve over in relation to that. So I'll leave it there, but I just want to make the point that utilitarian views can be, in fact, ultimately self-defeating.
Well, I'm probably more utilitarian than I am cosmopolitan. So you've hit the nail on the head in terms of my outlook on how migration policy should be developed. But I would just, I think, nevertheless, there is there is a benefit or there is a utility to having those arguments, having the data that we're talking about, and then going and making those arguments to the people who will be voting on matters such as Brexit, because I think there is a persuasive power to them. And I think the outreach and the engagement was persuasive in parts of the United Kingdom and was lacking in other parts. But it's not to say for a moment that I underestimate the challenge of winning that argument on an issue as emotive as migration. And once momentum and emotion come together on this issue, it's an incredibly difficult one politically to fight. So I guess part of the purpose of my talk and Proposition 3 was really prophylactic, rather than how to engage in pitched battle once some of those forces have taken hold and built momentum.
I come to it from a slightly different perspective, but not unrelated to what this gentleman was delivering. For many years ago, I worked with a lovely man, who described himself as the brain drain of Malta, because he had come from Malta, and he was, he was only partially joking, and he was a very talented, charming man who lived here and so on. The aspect that I think of when you talk about our migration policy, is there any ethical consideration given to the fact that we are taking the best and the brightest from countries who maybe would benefit from having the best and the brightest working for them, rather than filling the little gaps that makes Australia a little bit more comfortable? That's my question.
There are sort of a number of assumptions or parameters in the way that's been framed, and I'm going to dodge the question slightly in this way. When it comes to those considerations, I think the first detail is important, and what the relative contributions would need to be measured if you're engaging in some sort of ethical balancing in that sense. But as a Senator for Western Australia and a member of the Commonwealth Parliament, my interests are in advancing Australia's interests. And so that's how I come to this question.
We're going to take two more questions, and they're questions, and you're going to have to be really quick with those questions. I'm going to go to Marla for the next question. Marla's here. There.
Pardon me. Hi, my name's Mala Dharmananda, and mine is actually a simple question. You said you wanted the research about migration to be rigorous. So does the Commonwealth Government have any intention on collecting accurate data about migrants, a definition about who we are, culled, ethnic, multicultural, migrant, NES, second generation? ABS doesn't use consistent data. The Institute for Health and Welfare doesn't use consistent data. So I want to know that you're going to give us an undertaking. We're going to be counted the same forevermore across Australia.
As a member of the legislature and not the executive, it's not a question that I can answer on their behalf. But I think consistency across data sets, the sharing of data sets, and a more holistic approach to how we collect data are going to be very important in terms of building that foundation or that repository that I was talking about before.
Yeah, that for me is a critical question, because it's a bit like, when do you stop being a refugee? When do you stop being a migrant? How do you collect that data? Which box do you tick? It's very challenging for those of us involved in public policy. I'm going to take one last question, and I'm going to go there.
I was wondering if we might be able to expect to see an increase in emerging climate migration policies within Australia, and if so, how might we advocate for or argue for emerging climate migration policies, such as, say, like the one underneath the Fallapelli Union between Australia and Tuvalu, if the community sentiment is kind of against creating new migration policies and programs? Thank you.
There is no doubt that the number of climate refugees around the world is only going to grow, and so it's going to be a policy question that we all need to grapple with. But in a democracy, the short answer is you've got to win the argument. You've got to persuade people that we either, out of a sense of moral or humanitarian obligation, or for another reason, should do it. And that's essentially at the heart of how we need to approach it, which is if there's opposition to it, that opposition, you've essentially got to persuade them. And that's, that's at the heart of democratic politics, and I'm sure you and others are very capable of it. But yeah, that's my answer.
Good question to finish on. I'm going to thank Varun. It's interesting sitting here because, the questions come down and he has to think really quickly, but I think you answered them really well and very thoughtfully. So thank you very much. And I'm going to hand back to Paul, who's just going to close this evening with some other comments.
Thanks, Varun. Thanks, Maria, for leading the discussion tonight. We're more or less almost at the end, but we're trying to form a little bit of tradition here with the oration every year. So it's my pleasure to invite Professor Kanishka Jayasuriya just to say a few closing words. So Kanishka, the stage is all yours, sir.
Thank you, Paul. First of all, I'd like to thank Paul and Claire for putting this on, and I know it's a hard task and you've done a wonderful job. To Shamit for inaugurating this oration, which the family's very grateful, and to Maria for those wonderful remarks about my father. I know he worked closely with you, and he would be very pleased with those words. So thank you very much. And finally, of course, to our speaker, Varun, that was a really interesting and stimulating presentation. Very much a presentation that I think my father would have enjoyed, but he was always very argumentative, so he would have had arguments with you. And I think, first of all, I should say that I know you are filling a casual vacancy from Pat Dodson, and I think this is a good opportunity, as we acknowledge the Indigenous inhabitants, to acknowledge the incredible contribution that Pat Dodson has made to represent. In many ways, been a pioneer, I think, in that regard. So, all the best wishes to Pat Dodson. Finally, I think that I said to Paul, he was a bit anxious that I'm going to give him a couple of ideas. So I think at the end, I was not going to tell him about it. And I think, one of the things that would have pleased my father is what the British political theorist Anne Phipps calls the politics of presence, and that is to bring the experience, diversity, perspectives of the range of people that are in our community to our democratic polity. And my father was always very insistent that multiculturalism had to be political. It was not about, it was not about sort of attending multicultural festivals or culture, even though that's important. But it is about representation. Representation to him was the key, and he would have been very, very happy and proud that people like you in the federal parliament. I think he would have also been a bit surprised as well. So, for that, and to have Anne Ali giving the oration previously, I think it would have made him very pleased. And I guess I just want to end up with as an academic, I've got to say, when you talk about temporary migration, one of the things you should tell the executive is to fund the public education system a lot better, so we don't actually have to rely on international students to fund our public higher education system. Sorry, that's but I also think, and I think you raised a really important point about community sentiment, because in a sense that's a contradiction here, right? I mean, on one hand, even in the UK Parliament, there's been this enhanced diversity of representation, but at the same time, there's been this incredible resurgence of racism, especially, in our polls, now the mainstream of the Conservative Party, not, let alone reform. So I think that the question for us is, how do we deal with that? And I think we need to think about, the kind of bottom-up, and I said to run us, some of the anti-racist movements that we had in the 1970s and 80s, that were grassroots-driven rather than top-down, have to be rethought of. And I think that perhaps I could just put that as an idea. The second one, I would say, so this is for Paul really. I know you have a Women in Politics pathway, but I think we should have a politics pathway for minorities, and not just about getting into Parliament, about participating in the broad range of our political life, in political parties, in civic associations. And we really need that, and we really need to create those pathways, not just for, not just sort of middle class ethnic migrants, but essentially some working class migrants who are increasingly part of our community. So, Paul, here's an idea for the PPI and the board: create a political, just as you have for women in politics, have a program for ethnic minorities.
This is what I love about having Kanishka here. He always kind of throws out the challenges to me. And funny enough, it is something that myself and Claire and others actually have been speaking about. So what Kanishka is referring to is the Public Policy Institute runs a Pathways to Politics for Women program, which is a national program which is funded and supported by the Trawalla Foundation. And funny enough, we're running our program in a couple of weeks, in first week in September, and Claire's the manager and the champion of that and leading that. We do push for diversity within that program as much as possible. We look for cultural diversity, geographical diversity, LGBTQ diversity, all kinds of diversity within that. And we take 20 people, about 20 to 25 women on a year within that. But I think you hit on a very important point, and I've got some copies of this book that Shamad and Anna edited back in 2020, if you can remember, back in COVID times. And there's a number of little contributions in this which speak to that very point. Farida's here, her contribution in that there speaks to, what do we mean by representation? So the comment that came earlier on, it's just not about participation in cultural events, it's substantive participation in social, economic, cultural, and political life, basically, in a variety of different ways. And that representation has to be deep, and it has to be sustained. And at the very start, we were talking about this, and the federal government's doing well in terms of that measure at 10%. But if you look at local government, the level of government that is closest to the people, the way it often frames itself, cultural diversity representation isn't that strong, basically. In some places it is, but in overall terms, by the numbers, it's not that strong, basically. And similarly in the state government as well. So there's clearly work to be done in there. So thanks for the provocation. We'll have to get you up to do a talk sometime at the PPI, Kanishka. So look, I just wanted to say a big thanks again to Senator Varun Ghosh for coming out this evening. I had the pleasure of meeting Varun a few weeks ago and kind of working through what he was going to say, and extremely grounded, very amenable man, and thank you so much for coming along tonight, Varun. Thanks a lot. Thanks also to Maria for leading things tonight. When I always try to do things a little bit differently with different events every year when we move around and things. So, and for this one in particular, we had our board meeting last week and we were chatting about it, and I asked Maria, would she, given that she had such a close relationship with Laki, would she step up to the plate, and she very kindly did so. So thank you very much, Maria, for that as well. Thank you. Shamit for establishing the oration as well. Laki's contribution to scholarship and policy in migration and multiculturalism and citizenship, is on another level of things. So it is wonderful that he is recognised through this oration. So thank you very much, Shamit, for setting this up. So. And a big thank you to you for all coming out tonight. Without you, these events don't happen, really. We need an audience. It's amazing to see so many people come out who are interested and enthused by all of these things. And we look forward to seeing you at another PPI event soon. So travel home safely and see you all soon.